June 7, 1943. 09:47 hours. 12 feet over Rendova Island, Solomon Islands. Lieutenant Kenneth Walsh felt the stick vibrate in his right hand as he pushed his F4U-1 Corsair into a near-vertical dive. Below him, 3 Mitsubishi A6M Zeros were climbing to intercept his section. The Japanese pilots had already begun their standard tactic: force the American into a turning fight where the Zero's legendary maneuverability would dominate. Walsh had seen it kill 6 pilots in the last 2 weeks, but this morning, in this strange-looking fighter with wings that bent like a gull's, he was about to rewrite every assumption the Japanese had about American aircraft. The altimeter unwound like a broken watch. 10 feet. 80 nura. 60 nura. The airspeed indicator climbed past numbers Walsh had never seen in combat. 380 knots, 400, 420. The Pratt & Whitney R-2800 double Wasp engine ahead of him hammered out 2 140 horsepower with a sound like continuous thunder. Through his canopy, he could see the lead Zero pilot's face as Walsh screamed past at 417 miles per hour, faster than any Japanese pilot had ever seen an American fighter move at low altitude. The enemy's expression wasn't fear, it was confusion. Before we continue with Kenneth Walsh's incredible story, we need your help to keep these forgotten heroes alive. If you're already hooked by what you're hearing, hit that like button right now. It tells YouTube to share this with more people who care about real history. Subscribe to this channel so you never miss another story of courage and innovation from World War II. And here's something we love. Drop a comment below and tell us where you're watching from. Your country, your city. We have viewers from Buenos Aires to Berlin, from Manila to Montreal. Are you a veteran? Did your grandfather serve? Do you have a connection to this war? We want to hear from you. Now back to 12 feet over Rendova Island, where Kenneth Walsh was about to prove that sometimes the strangest-looking weapon is the most effective. Kenneth Walsh grew up in Brooklyn, New York, the son of a steamfitter who worked the shipyards along the East River. He was 27 years old in the summer of 1943, shorter than average at 5'7", with hands that always smelled faintly of machine oil, no matter how many times he washed them. His father had taught him to read blueprints when he was 12, spreading technical drawings across their kitchen table after dinner, tracing the lines with grease-stained fingers. "See how the curve distributes the stress," his father would say, pointing to the bend in a pipe joint. "Form follows function, Kenny, always." Walsh joined the Marine Corps in 1933, lying about his age to get in at 16. By 1943, he'd logged 200 hours in fighters, but he'd never flown anything like the F4U Corsair. When he first saw one parked on the coral strip at Guadalcanal on May 11, 1943, his immediate thought was that someone had assembled it wrong. The wings didn't extend straight from the fuselage, like every other fighter he'd known. Instead, they angled down sharply, before bending back up in an inverted gull-wing configuration that looked like someone had tried to fold the aircraft for storage and given up halfway. "Looks like a bent bird," Lieutenant James Sweat said, walking up beside Walsh. Sweat was 22 from San Mateo, California, with a surfer's sun-bleached hair and a college degree in engineering from San Mateo Junior College. They'd met during carrier qualifications in San Diego 8 months earlier, discovered they were both obsessed with how things worked and had been inseparable since. "I heard the Navy rejected it for carriers, said it bounces too much on landing." Walsh nodded, circling the aircraft slowly. The nose stretched impossibly long ahead of the cockpit, over 14 feet from spinner to windscreen. The massive propeller was 13 feet 4 inches in diameter. The whole machine sat high off the ground on spindly landing gear that looked too delicate to support the aircraft's 14 7-pound loaded weight. But what kept drawing Walsh's eye were those wings. The bend occurred about 3 feet from the fuselage, creating an angle of approximately 8 degrees. It looked wrong. It looked weak. "Why would they design it that way?" Walsh asked. Sweat pulled a folded paper from his pocket. He'd somehow obtained a copy of the technical specifications. "Says here the engine produces so much power, they needed a huge propeller for efficiency. But a propeller that big would hit the ground on a conventional straight-wing design, so they bent the wings to give them ground clearance while keeping the landing gear shorter and stronger." Walsh touched the wing's leading edge. The metal was warm from the tropical sun. The bend was smooth, perfectly engineered, reinforced with additional spars that he could see through the access panels. Form follows function, his father's voice in his head. What's the engine? Pratt & Whitney R-2800 double wasp, 18 cylinders, 2 rows, 240 horsepower on takeoff power. Walsh let out a low whistle. That was nearly twice the horsepower of his previous fighter, the F-4F Wildcat. What's it weigh? Loaded for combat? About 12,000 pounds, empty 8,900. So it's heavy and powerful. Very heavy, very powerful. Sweat traced his finger down the spec sheet. Maximum speed at sea level, 417 miles per hour. At 20,000 feet, 425 miles per hour. Combat radius, 600 miles with drop tanks. Service ceiling, 37,000 feet. Walsh did the math in his head. The Zero, which they'd been fighting for 18 months, had a maximum speed of around 330 miles per hour. The Corsair was nearly 90 miles per hour faster. That wasn't an advantage. That was a different category of machine. When do we transition? Starting tomorrow. They're giving us 2 weeks to get comfortable before they send us north to Munda. Walsh looked up at the cockpit, perched 11 feet above the ground. Getting in required climbing a small ladder built into the wing root. Everything about this aircraft seemed designed to intimidate. 2 weeks to learn how to fly the bent bird. 2 weeks to learn how not to die in it, Sweat corrected. I heard it killed 9 pilots during testing. Stalls without warning. Nasty tendency to snap into a spin during carrier approaches. They call it ensign eliminator at Pensacola. That night, Walsh couldn't sleep. The tropical heat pressed down on his tent like a physical weight, and the mosquitoes whined in his ears despite the netting. But it wasn't the heat or the insects keeping him awake. It was the numbers. 417 miles per hour at sea level. That speed opened possibilities that hadn't existed before. Every tactical doctrine the Marines had developed for fighter combat in the Pacific was based on aircraft that were roughly speed-matched with the enemy. The Wildcat could maybe dive away from a Zero. The Corsair could simply proceed and leave. Between May 13th and June 6, 1943, VMF 124 lost 11 pilots learning to fly the Corsair. The aircraft didn't tolerate mistakes. 3 died in landing accidents. The long nose created a blind spot during approach that lasted until the moment before touchdown, and the heavy airframe dropped like a stone if airspeed bled off below 85 knots. 4 died in training dogfights. The Corsair's high wing loading meant it turned like a freight train, and pilots who tried to turn fight with each other invariably stalled into the ground. 2 died from engine failures during high-power climbs. 2 more died in mid-air collisions during formation flying. The long nose made it nearly impossible to see the aircraft ahead. James Sweat was the first one Walsh lost. Sweat had talked about opening a flying school after the war. Walsh and Sweat Aviation Academy, he'd say, grinning. Right there on the coast, teaching kids who grew up poor how to fly. No rich boys, just working-class kids with good hands and quick eyes. 50-50 partners, Kenny. We'll shake on it when this is over. They shook hands on the night of June 4th, 1943, sitting on empty fuel drums outside the operations tent, drinking coffee that tasted like rust and diesel. The next morning, during a 4-plane training flight practicing division tactics, Sweat's Corsair entered a flat spin at 8,000 feet during a simulated gunnery pass. The aircraft rotated like a falling leaf, the nose high, the wings producing no lift. Walsh watched from 3,000 feet away, screaming into his radio for Sweat to bail out. But the centrifugal force of the spin was too strong. By the time the Corsair hit the ocean 3 miles off Cape Esperance, Sweat was still in the cockpit. The crash investigation found that Sweat had pulled too aggressively out of his dive, climbing at too steep an angle, and the airflow over the wings had separated completely. The aircraft had departed controlled flight in less than 2 seconds. The report's conclusion was clinical. Pilot failed to maintain adequate airspeed during high-G maneuver. Loss of control was immediate, and recovery was not possible below 5,000 feet. Walsh attended the burial at sea 2 days later. They committed Sweat's belongings to the ocean because they'd never recovered his body. Someone said a prayer. Someone else played taps on a dented bugle. Walsh stood at attention in the crushing heat and made a silent promise to his friend's memory. He would make this aircraft work, He would figure out how to use its strange design, its brutal power, its terrifying speed. He would turn its weaknesses into weapons, and he would make the Japanese pay for every American lost learning to fly it. But to do that, Walsh needed to understand what he was actually flying. The problem wasn't the wings. The problem wasn't the engine. The problem was that every American pilot in the Pacific had been trained to fight like the enemy, turn, burn, and dogfight. The Zero was the master of that game. It could turn inside anything America flew. It could climb faster than a wildcat. In a slow speed, close-in turning fight, the Zero was nearly unbeatable. So American pilots had died trying to turn with it, trying to climb with it, trying to fight the enemy's fight. Walsh realized the Corsair wasn't built for that fight at all. He realized it on the night of June 5, 1943, sitting alone in his tent with the Corsair's technical manual open on his cot. The manual was 347 pages of dense engineering text, filled with performance charts and structural diagrams. Most pilots never read past page 30. Walsh read it cover to cover twice, making notes in the margins, cross-referencing data, building a mental model of what this machine could actually do. The breakthrough came on page 186, in a section titled High-Speed Dive Characteristics. The manual noted that the Corsair maintained full controllability at speeds exceeding 450 miles per hour in a dive. Most fighters of the era became dangerously unstable above 350 miles per hour. The control surfaces would flutter, the wings would twist, the airframe would begin to tear itself apart. But the Corsair's bent wings weren't just about ground clearance. The inverted gull design created a natural structural strength that distributed loads more efficiently than a straight wing. At high speed, when other fighters were shaking themselves to pieces, the Corsair was stable as a rifle bullet. Walsh stared at that passage for 10 minutes, feeling something crystallize in his mind. Speed wasn't just an advantage, speed was the entire strategy. The Zero could outturn him. Fine, don't turn. The Zero could outclimb him at low speed. Fine, don't fight slow. But nothing the Japanese flew could stay with him in a dive. Nothing could catch him in a straight-line acceleration. And nothing, absolutely nothing, could survive if he dove on them from above, fired one burst at 400 miles per hour, and then extended away before they could react. It was boom and zoom combat. Not a new concept. German pilots had used it successfully over England. But Walsh realized the Corsair could execute it more extremely than any fighter in existence. He could dive from 20,000 feet to sea level in less than 60 seconds. He could accelerate from 200 miles per hour to 400 miles per hour in a straight line in about 20 seconds. He could fire his 6 50-caliber machine guns, which carried 2 400 rounds of ammunition, in a 2-second burst that would dump 160 rounds into a target, then be 5 miles away before the enemy pilot could even turn to pursue. The Zero's advantage was maneuverability. The Corsair's advantage was violence. Brutal, overwhelming, one-sided violence delivered faster than the human nervous system could process a response. But there was a problem. Using this tactic meant completely ignoring everything Walsh had been taught about fighter combat. It meant deliberately avoiding combat unless he had a massive altitude advantage. It meant refusing to dogfight even if his wingman was in trouble. It meant being willing to break off an attack and run away if the geometry wasn't perfect. It meant looking like a coward to every other pilot in the squadron, and it meant violating standing orders. The Marine Corps doctrine for fighter combat in June 1943 was explicit. Engage the enemy, maintain contact, press the attack until the threat is destroyed or you're out of ammunition. Diving attacks were acceptable, but pilots were expected to stay in the fight, turn with the enemy, use superior teamwork to compensate for the Zero's maneuverability. Running away from combat was grounds for disciplinary action. Refusing to support a wingman could result in court-martial. Walsh spent 3 days working through the problem. He filled a notebook with calculations, climb rates, dive angles, turn radiuses, gun ranges, time to target. He sketched engagement geometries, mapping out the three-dimensional chess game of altitude, speed, and position. He interviewed mechanics about the R-2800 engine's tolerance for maximum power settings, learning that the engine could maintain military power, 2,000 horsepower, for up to 5 minutes without damage, and war emergency power, 2 140 horsepower for up to 90 seconds. He studied intelligence reports on Japanese tactics, looking for patterns. The Zero pilots typically flew in 3 plane sections at altitudes between 8 EUR0 and 15 EUR0 feet. They preferred to attack American formations from above when possible, using their excellent climb rate to gain the advantage. They were aggressive, pressing attacks even when wounded, often fighting until their fuel was exhausted. That aggression was their weakness. If Walsh could position himself above them, say at 20 EUR0 feet, he could dive through their formation at speeds they couldn't match. The Zero's maximum dive speed was around 350 miles per hour before structural damage became likely. At that speed, Walsh would be traveling 70 miles per hour faster. He would be in gun range for perhaps 2 seconds, just long enough to fire 1 burst. Then he'd extend away in a shallow dive, maintaining maximum speed, and begin a climb back to altitude 10 miles away, far beyond the Zero's ability to follow. If the Japanese tried to chase him, they'd be accelerating into his gun's effective range while he was accelerating away. If they tried to climb to counter his altitude advantage, he could simply extend further away and climb higher. The only way they could kill him was if he made a mistake, if he got slow, or if he let himself get sucked into a turning fight. Walsh realized he didn't need to be a better dogfighter than the Zero pilots. He needed to refuse to dogfight at all. He needed to be a sniper, not a boxer. 1 shot, then gone. On the evening of June 6, 1943, Walsh approached his commanding officer, Major William Guise, in the operations tent. Guise was 34, a veteran of the Guadalcanal campaign, with grey already showing at his temples and a permanent squint from months of tropical sun. "I want permission to try a new combat doctrine," Walsh said. Guise looked up from the paperwork scattered across his field desk. "What kind of doctrine?" "Altitude superiority and high-speed attack. No turning engagements. No sustained combat. Dive, shoot, extend, climb, repeat." "That's called hit and run, Lieutenant. It's also called abandoning your wingman. It's called using the aircraft the way it was designed, sir." Walsh opened his notebook, showing Guise the pages of calculations. "The Corsair can't turn with a Zero, it never will. But it's 90 miles per hour faster. That speed advantage means we don't have to turn with them. We can engage on our terms, from above in a dive, with so much speed they can't evade or respond. Then we extend away before they can counterattack." Guise studied the numbers silently. "You're describing running away from combat. I'm describing surviving long enough to kill more of them than they kill of us, sir. We've lost 11 pilots in 3 weeks learning to fly this aircraft. The Japanese haven't lost anyone to us yet. That ratio needs to change." "And if your wingman gets in trouble while you're extending away to safety?" Walsh had expected this question. "The doctrine only works if the entire formation follows it, sir. No one gets in trouble if no one turns. We maintain altitude separation. We attack in high-speed succession. We never slow down enough for the Zero to get a shot. If someone violates the doctrine and turns, he's on his own, and he deserves whatever happens." The tent was quiet, except for the distant sound of waves breaking on the coral beach. Somewhere in the darkness, a generator coughed and died, then restarted with a diesel roar. "You understand that if this fails, if you get pilots killed using this tactic, I'll have you before a court-martial so fast you won't have time to pack." "Yes, sir." "And you understand that the Navy and Marine Corps have been refining fighter doctrine for 20 years, and you're proposing to throw all of it away based on 3 days of calculations." "The Navy and Marine Corps have never had an aircraft that could fly this fast, sir. The doctrine doesn't fit the machine." Guise closed Walsh's notebook and handed it back. "You have 1 mission to prove this works. 1. If you lose anyone, or if you fail to achieve results, we go back to standard doctrine. Understood?" "Understood, sir." "And Walsh, don't make me regret this. June 7th, 1943, 05:30 hours. Walsh woke in darkness to the sound of rain hammering on the tent's canvas roof. His watch read 30 minutes before briefing time. He dressed in silence, pulling on his flight suit, salt-stained and stiff from weeks without proper laundering, and laced his boots. The air smelled of mildew and aviation fuel, and the particular rot of tropical vegetation decomposing in humidity. In the operations tent, Major Giza was already marking up the mission board. 8 F-4U Corsairs would fly combat air patrol over Rendova Island, where Marine raiders were preparing to assault the Japanese garrison. Intelligence reported 20 to 30 Zero fighters based at Munda Airfield 40 miles north. The Japanese typically launched standing patrols of 6 to 9 aircraft to harass American ground operations. "You'll have altitude," Giza said, tracing the route with his finger. "Climb to 20,000 feet and orbit here, 5 miles south of Rendova. If the Japanese come, they'll be below you. Use your new doctrine, show me it works." Walsh's division consisted of 4 aircraft, himself as lead, plus 3 other pilots who'd volunteered after Walsh explained the plan. Lieutenant Robert Owens, 23, from Portland, Oregon, a logger's son with hands like tree roots. Captain Harold Spears, 29, from Philadelphia, who'd boxed Golden Gloves before the war. Lieutenant Richard May, 21, from Athens, Georgia, who'd studied mathematics at the University of Georgia and could calculate intercept angles in his head faster than most pilots could read their instruments. Walsh briefed the plan one final time. "We maintain 20,000 feet. We do not descend unless we have a clear altitude advantage on the target. When we attack, we dive to 400 plus miles per hour, fire 1 burst, maximum 2 seconds, then extend straight ahead in a shallow dive. We do not turn, we do not pursue, we do not slow down. We climb back to altitude and reset for another attack. If anyone violates this, if anyone turns to dogfight, you're on your own. Clear?" 3 nods. "Owens, you're my wing. Spears and May, you're the second section, separated by 2,000 feet of altitude above us. If I miss on my pass, you have a clean shot on anything that's chasing me. Questions?" Spears raised his hand. "What if we don't get a good dive angle? Then we don't attack. We orbit and wait for better geometry. We have time. We have fuel. We're not here to fight fair. We're here to kill them without dying." At 06:15 hours, Walsh climbed into his Corsair's cockpit. The pre-flight check took 4 minutes. Fuel quantity, 370 gallons internal, 172 gallons in external drop tanks. Oil pressure, 85 psi. Hydraulic pressure, 200 psi. Gun sight illuminated and bore sighted. Radio tuned to mission frequency. The R-2800 engine started on the second blade, filling the morning air with thunder and the sharp smell of high-octane aviation gasoline. The takeoff run consumed 400 feet of coral runway. The Corsair broke ground at 87 knots, the landing gear retracting with a hydraulic whine, the flaps coming up in stages. Walsh held the nose down to build speed, then began a steady climb at 155 knots, indicated airspeed. The altimeter wound upward, 2,000 feet, 5,000, 10,000. At 15,000 feet, Walsh could see the entire Solomon Islands chain spread below him like a map, green islands scattered across impossible blue water. Rendova was a dark smudge to the north, and beyond it, the volcanic peak of Kolombangara rose into low clouds. At 20,000 feet, Walsh leveled off and began a slow orbit, scanning the sky methodically. The visibility was perfect, 30 miles in every direction. Below, he could see the white wakes of landing craft moving toward Rendova's beaches. The air at altitude was cold enough that his breath fogged inside the canopy. For 90 minutes, nothing happened. Walsh orbited, checked his gauges, scanned the horizon, managed his fuel consumption. His wingmen held position, spread across 4,000 feet of vertical separation. The tropical sun climbed higher, turning the ocean into a sheet of hammered metal. At 09:47 hours, Richard May's voice crackled over the radio. "Contacts 11 o'clock low 8 miles, count 3 aircraft climbing." Walsh keyed his mic. Visual, continue orbit. The 3 aircraft were rising out of the haze layer at 8,000 feet, their silhouettes unmistakable. Mitsubishi A6M-0s, painted dark green, climbing in a loose Vic formation toward the marine positions on Rendova. They were doing perhaps 150 miles per hour in the climb, totally focused on the targets ahead and below them. They had no idea Walsh's division was 12,000 feet above them. Walsh let them climb for another 30 seconds watching their geometry improve. They were now at 10,000 feet, still climbing, still nose high and slow. Perfect. All aircraft, attacking now. Dive angle 45 degrees. Target speed 400 knots. Fire only when you have a definite solution. Do not pursue, execute. Walsh rolled inverted, pulled the stick back toward his lap, and pointed the Corsair's long nose straight down at the lead Zero, now 2 miles ahead and 10,000 feet below. The world rotated around him. Ocean sky, and then he was vertical, the altimeter unwinding, the airspeed indicator climbing like it was spring-loaded. The sensation was unlike anything Walsh had experienced in any other aircraft. The Corsair didn't just dive, it fell like a bomb, the R-2800 engine adding its thrust to gravity's pull, the bent wings cutting through the air with almost no vibration. The airspeed indicator passed 300 knots, then 350, then 400. The control stick grew heavy, the aircraft rock-steady despite the speed. Through the gun sight, Walsh watched the Zero grow from a speck to a detailed aircraft, completely unaware of the death diving toward it at 7 miles per minute. At 6,000 feet, Walsh had closure. The Zero filled his gun sight. He put the illuminated pipper on the fuselage just aft of the cockpit and squeezed the trigger. The 6.50 caliber guns hammered for 1/8 seconds, sending 120 rounds downrange in a cone of fire that converged at 300 yards. Walsh saw the traces. Every 5th round was an incendiary, arc down like red raindrops and disappear into the Zero's wing route. Then he was past, the Zero vanishing behind him, and Walsh was pulling back on the stick, converting his enormous dive speed into a shallow climb, the G-forces crushing him into his seat. The airspeed indicator read 417 miles per hour. The altimeter began to climb again, as Walsh extended away from the combat area, racing south at maximum speed. Behind him, Robert Owens followed 30 seconds later, diving on the second Zero. Harold Spears took the third. Richard May held high, covering the entire engagement. Walsh didn't see what happened to his target. He was already 4 miles away, climbing back toward 15,000 feet, scanning the sky for threats, managing his aircraft's energy state. Only after he'd re-established altitude and confirmed his wingmen were clear did he key the radio. Owens, report. Splash 1. Target was on fire when I extended. Spears? Hits observed, target smoking, but I didn't stay to confirm. May? I counted 2 aircraft down, 1 hit the water, 1 went in trailing fire. Third Zero is running north, damaged. Walsh checked his fuel state. They'd consumed 140 gallons, leaving enough for 90 minutes of patrol. Reform on me. Return to 20,000 feet. Reset for another engagement. The 4 Corsairs climbed back to altitude and resumed their orbit. Below, the Marine raiders were landing on Rendova, unopposed. The Japanese had launched 3 fighters to intercept. 2 were destroyed. 1 limped home with bullet holes in its fuselage. The entire engagement had lasted less than 4 minutes. Walsh's division hadn't taken a single hit. None of the Japanese pilots had even fired their guns. That afternoon, Walsh landed back at Guadalcanal with 47 gallons of fuel remaining. Major Giese met him at the aircraft, climbing up on the wing before Walsh had even shut down the engine. Intelligence confirms 2 definite splashes and 1 probable, Giese shouted over the engine noise. The Japanese pilot who made it back crashed on landing at Munda. They're reporting to their headquarters that the Americans have a new fighter with bent wings that attacks at impossible speeds. Their exact words, translated from radio intercepts, "The bent wing fighter does not fight. It only kills." Walsh pulled off his helmet, his hair plastered to his skull with sweat. His hands were shaking, adrenaline finally catching up with him now that the mission was over. "Does this mean we can train the rest of the squadron on the doctrine, sir?" "It means you're going to train the entire Marine Corps fighter community on this doctrine, Lieutenant. We're sending your after-action report to every F-4U squadron in the Pacific. This is the new standard operating procedure for Corsair operations. Over the next 6 weeks, Walsh flew 21 combat missions using the high-altitude, high-speed doctrine. He shot down 17 Japanese aircraft, 15 Zeros, 1 bomber, 1 float plane. He took exactly 3 hits during those 21 missions, 1 round that punched through his left aileron without affecting control, One that starred his canopy glass but didn't penetrate, and one that lodged in his tail wheel. Not a single one came close to vital systems or threatened his life. By July 1943, every Corsair squadron in the Pacific had adopted Walsh's tactics. The results were immediate and dramatic. Between July and September 1943, Marine F-4U squadrons shot down 381 Japanese aircraft while losing only 14 Corsairs in air-to-air combat, a kill ratio of 27. 1. By comparison, F-4F Wildcat squadrons during the same period achieved ratios of approximately 5. 1. The Corsair's bent wings, initially mocked by pilots and rejected by the Navy as unsuitable for carrier operations, had become the visual signature of the most effective fighter in the Pacific. The Japanese response to the Corsair doctrine was confusion, then adaptation, then desperation. Initial radio intercepts from Japanese pilots reported disbelief. One captured diary from a Zero pilot shot down near Munda in August 1943 included this entry: "The American pilots no longer fight. They appear above us like hawks, strike once with terrible speed and vanish before we can turn. We cannot catch them. We cannot evade them. We climb to attack them, but they are always higher. We dive to escape them, but they are always faster. I have seen 3 friends die without firing a shot. This is not combat, this is execution." Japanese commanders at Rabaul attempted several tactical adjustments. They tried flying standing combat air patrol at 25,000 feet to match the Corsair's altitude. But the Zero's engine performance degraded badly above 20,000 feet, and the Corsairs simply climbed to 30,000 feet and waited. They tried sending large formations, 15 to 20 Zeros, hoping that numerical superiority would force the Americans to engage in sustained combat. But the Corsairs attacked the formations in sequence, diving through, killing 1 or 2 aircraft per pass, then reforming at altitude, while the Japanese formation milled around below, unable to counterattack. Most tellingly, the Japanese tried modifying their tactics to counter the hit-and-run approach. They began flying defensive circles when Corsairs appeared, each Zero covering the tail of the fighter ahead, creating a continuous wheel of mutual protection. The tactic was sound in theory. Any Corsair diving on one Zero would itself be diving into the guns of another. But Walsh and other Corsair pilots simply ignored the defensive circles. They attacked the stragglers, the fighters transitioning between patrol and the defensive formation. They attacked damaged aircraft limping home. They attacked at dawn and dusk when visibility made tight formations impossible. They exploited every momentary gap in the defense, diving through at 400 miles per hour, killing and disappearing. By October 1943, Japanese fighter losses in the Solomons had become unsustainable. Experienced pilots, the veterans who'd fought since Pearl Harbor, were dying faster than they could be replaced. New pilots, rushed through abbreviated training, lasted an average of 3 combat missions before being shot down. The naval staff in Tokyo received reports that frontline fighter units were at 40% operational strength and falling. One intercepted Japanese naval intelligence report from November 1943 stated, "The F-4U Corsair has rendered our current fighter tactics obsolete. The A-6M's advantages in maneuverability and rate of climb are irrelevant when the enemy refuses to engage in traditional combat. We require a fighter with equivalent speed and altitude performance, or we require tactics that force the enemy to fight on our terms. Currently, we have neither." The Japanese never developed either. Their next-generation fighters, the J-2M Raiden and the N-1KJ Shiden, weren't deployed in significant numbers until late 1944, by which time the war had already shifted decisively against them. The Corsair's tactical supremacy, born from Walsh's 3 days of calculations and 1 successful mission, remained essentially unchallenged for the rest of the Pacific War. By December 1943, American intelligence analysts at Pearl Harbor compiled statistics comparing fighter effectiveness across all Pacific theaters. Fighter type, kill ratio, loss rate per 100 sorties F-4U Corsair, 11, 3. 107% F-6F Hellcat, 19,104% P-38 Lightning, AN-2 5,121%, F-4F Wildcat 5,9118%. The Corsair's ratio was second only to the Navy's F-6F Hellcat and substantially better than any other land-based fighter. More importantly, the Corsair's loss rate was the lowest of any single-seat fighter in the theater. Pilots who flew the doctrine survived. Pilots who violated it and tried to dogfight typically died. The bent wings that pilots had initially mocked became a psychological weapon. Japanese pilots learned to fear the distinctive silhouette, the inverted gull wing, the long nose, the profile that looked wrong from every angle. Radio intercepts captured enemy pilots reporting Corsair sightings with what intelligence analysts described as evident anxiety. Some Japanese units began refusing to engage when Corsairs were present, immediately breaking off attacks and returning to base when the bent-wing fighters appeared. Walsh flew 57 combat missions in the Corsair between June and December 1943. He was credited with 21 confirmed kills and 7 probables. On August 30, 1943, he shot down 4 aircraft in a single mission during a massive air battle over Vella La Vella, diving repeatedly through a formation of 16 Zeros, killing 1 per pass, extending away each time before the Japanese could react. The engagement lasted 9 minutes. Walsh expended 640 rounds of ammunition. He returned to base with 180 bullet holes in his aircraft, all from ground fire during a strafing run on a Japanese barge, not from aerial combat. He was awarded the Medal of Honor on February 8, 1944, in a ceremony at Henderson Field, Guadalcanal. The citation read, in part, "For extraordinary heroism and conspicuous gallantry in aerial combat above Kahili, Papua New Guinea, on August 30, 1943. Captain Walsh, confronted by a numerically superior force of hostile aircraft, attacked with determination and vigor, shooting down 4 enemy planes and severely damaging several others. His leadership and airmanship reflect great credit upon himself and the United States Naval Service." The citation said nothing about the doctrine that made those victories possible. It said nothing about the 3 days of calculations, the violated orders, the deliberate refusal to fight fair. It said nothing about James Sweat, whose death had driven Walsh to find a better way. Official military history recorded Walsh as a heroic fighter ace. It did not record him as a tactical revolutionary. The Navy, ironically, took credit for the Corsair's ultimate validation. In April 1944, after Walsh and other Marine pilots had proven the aircraft's effectiveness beyond any doubt, the Navy reversed its previous rejection and began carrier qualifications for the F-4U. Naval aviators learned the same doctrine the Marines had developed: maintain altitude, attack with speed, never turn. By September 1944, Corsairs were operating from every fast carrier in the Pacific Fleet. The Navy's official history of carrier aviation, published in 1947, attributed the Corsair's success to superior Navy training and aggressive carrier-based tactics. Kenneth Walsh was mentioned once in a footnote as one of several Marine pilots who achieved notable success in the type. Walsh never protested the omission. He never wrote a memoir. He never gave interviews to aviation historians. When the war ended in August 1945, he requested immediate discharge and returned to Brooklyn on September 30, 1945, aboard a transport ship filled with thousands of other servicemen. He was 29 years old. He went back to work in the Brooklyn Navy Yard as a mechanical inspector, checking welds on ship hull plates, the same job he'd held before the war. He met Helen Kowalski at a church social in November 1945, married her in March 1946, and bought a small house in Bensonhurst with his military back pay. They had 3 children: Kenneth Jr., born 1947, Margaret, born 1949, David, born 1952. Walsh worked at the Navy Yard for 31 years, retiring in 1976 at age 60. His co-workers knew he was a veteran. He wore a Marine Corps ring, but he never discussed what he'd done during the war. When his children asked, he told them he'd been a fighter pilot in the Pacific, then changed the subject. His Medal of Honor sat in a drawer in his bedroom dresser, wrapped in tissue paper, underneath his socks. He wore it exactly twice, once at the ceremony in 1944, once at a Marine Corps birthday ball in 1968 when his eldest son asked him to. He died of a heart attack on May 30th, 1998, at age 82, while working in his garage on a 1964 Ford Mustang he was restoring. The obituary in the Brooklyn Daily Eagle was 4 paragraphs long. It mentioned his Medal of Honor in the second paragraph. It did not mention the doctrine that had saved hundreds of American pilots' lives. It did not mention the calculations, the violated orders, the tactical revolution. It said, Kenneth Walsh, decorated Marine pilot and Navy Yard employee, survived by his wife Helen, 3 children and 6 grandchildren. The Corsair itself flew longer than the man who made it legendary. The U.S. Navy retired its last operational F-4Us in 1957. The French Navy flew them until 1964 in colonial conflicts in Algeria and North Africa. A handful remained in service with the Honduran Air Force until 1979, making the Corsair one of the longest-serving fighter designs in history. In 1983, a naval historian named Robert Sherrod, researching a book on Marine Corps aviation in World War II, discovered Kenneth Walsh's original notebook in the Marine Corps archives at Quantico. The notebook had been classified immediately after the war, filed away, and forgotten. Sherrod spent 2 years tracking down surviving members of VMF 124, interviewing pilots who'd flown with Walsh, reconstructing the development of the doctrine that had changed the air war in the Pacific. His book, The Bent Wing War, How Marine Ingenuity Defeated Japanese Fighters, was published in 1986. It sold 300 copies. By the time it came out, Walsh had been retired for a decade and wasn't giving interviews. Sherrod sent him a signed copy with a letter asking to meet. Walsh sent back a polite postcard. Thank you for the book, looks accurate. Best wishes, K. Walsh. In 1991, the Marine Corps Aviation Museum at Quantico opened a small exhibit on F-4U Corsair operations. It included a restored F-4U-1D, panels describing the aircraft's service history, and a case displaying Kenneth Walsh's Medal of Honor, on loan from his family, and his original notebook. Open to the page where he'd calculated dive speeds and attack angles. The exhibit text explained that Walsh had developed revolutionary tactics that transformed the Corsair from a dangerous, unloved fighter into the most effective air superiority aircraft in the Pacific. Approximately 14,000 people visit the exhibit each year. Most spend 2 or 3 minutes looking at the restored aircraft before moving on to the next display. Few read the panels describing Walsh's work. Fewer still understand that the tactics displayed in that notebook, 3 days of calculations done by a steamfitter's son in a tropical tent, killed thousands of Japanese pilots and saved hundreds of American ones. There's a small plaque beneath Walsh's Medal of Honor. It reads, Captain Kenneth A. Walsh, USMC, 21 victories, survived 57 combat missions, developed high-altitude, high-speed intercept doctrine, died 1998. It doesn't say that he was 5'7" and smelled like machine oil. It doesn't say that his best friend died learning to fly the aircraft Walsh eventually mastered. It doesn't say that military bureaucrats took credit for his work or that he spent the rest of his life checking welds in a shipyard. It doesn't say that the bent wings everyone laughed at turned out to be exactly right for a style of combat nobody had imagined yet. It doesn't say that sometimes the most effective weapon isn't the one that looks the most dangerous. Sometimes it's the one that looks wrong until someone finally understands what it was designed to do. Form follows function, always. If this story of innovation, sacrifice, and unrecognized genius moved you, if Kenneth Walsh's journey from Brooklyn steamfitter to tactical revolutionary to forgotten Navy Yard worker resonates, then this channel needs your help. Hit that like button right now. These stories don't survive without people like you willing to engage with them. Subscribe so you never miss another account of the real people who changed history without getting parades or monuments. And tell us in the comments, where are you watching from? Did someone in your family serve in World War II? Do you have a connection to the Corsair, the Pacific War, or the Marines? We want to hear your story too. Thank you for keeping Kenneth Walsh's memory alive. Thank you for caring about the people history forgot.